All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi guys, good morning. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. We appreciate you guys spending the next half hour or so learning about IP surveillance systems today. My name is Ken Miguel. Here with me today is one of our technical support engineers, Michael Lugo. Mike, how are you?
Doing great, Ken. Thanks for asking.
Good, good. And this webinar is brought to you by Bolide Technology Group. With over 20 years of experience in the security industry, we offer a variety of solutions ranging from HD over coax to DVRs to IP cameras, NVRs, servers, and all the accessories that you guys would need as far as video surveillance. So in this webinar, we are going back to basics with IP. This is Bolide IP Basics Part 2. So Part 1, we talked about how to pretty much connect an IP camera to an NVR. Pretty basic stuff. In this webinar, it'll be a little bit different. We're going to show you guys how to connect IP cameras. At the same time, we're going to show you how to get into the camera's settings and actually configure it and make it retrofit for the particular application that you guys are doing. So part of this webinar, we're going to go over key terms in regards to IP surveillance. We're going to talk about port forwarding, steps in doing port forwarding. We're going to talk about network configuration tools and configuring the NVRs and cameras during installation. And during this whole webinar, we're actually going to go do a step-by-step in navigating our camera's GUI and interface. Just want to remind everybody, if you guys have any questions, feel free to type it in on the questions box that you see on the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer them as we go through this webinar. So let's go ahead and start. Okay, so let's start with basic terms that you guys need to know about in dealing with IP. Of course, all networks, large or small, require specialized network hardware to make them work. These are certain settings as well as that you would need to be aware of to optimize your network. So these are some of the terms. First is bitrate. Bitrate refers to the number of bits or the amount of data that are processed over a certain amount of time. An example, a 2 megapixel IP camera, 1080p, transmits 4096 kbps. Mike, why is bitrate a significant part of IP surveillance?
Well, it's real important, Ken, because just because you have your camera at 2 megs, now we know how much data that's going to transmit, but if you lower that, then you're able to still get the 2 megs at a lower rate. It's going to affect, of course, the picture. But these are certain things that we're going to go through and let you know how to adjust them to optimize your recording time, your image, and what's going to suit the customer.
So that means this is in terms of what their network infrastructure can handle.
Correct.
Right? So certain network infrastructures has a certain amount of bandwidth that can contain, and it's important for you guys to know bitrate so you know at what bitrate you should run X amount of cameras to be able to make it all work together.
Correct.
Without any flaws. All right. FPS, we all know this, frames per second. It's rate at which an imaging device displays consecutive images. Frame rates also applies to DVRs, movies, TV. You've heard of real-time frames per second. And this also plays a big part in your IP installation because
so this is extremely important because lowering your frame rate can get almost double the amount of hard drive space out of your recorder. So, real time is 24, 30 frames per second. But if you lower it to 15 frames per second, maybe sometimes even lower, you might not even see a difference in the frames per second. So you're doubling your hard drive space by decreasing the frames per second in half. You can double your hard drive space and not really lose any quality of picture or even see the difference in frames.
Well, it depends on your application, right?
Correct.
I mean, an example would be a casino application.
Yeah.
These projects require real-time frames per second.
Yeah, and that's important too, because situations like that where they have to see, hands are pretty quick. You might have to see every frame that goes by. So yeah, situations like that, you do have to keep the frames per second at a real time.
Okay, and this is really the difference between going with an IP solution, because with a DVR or HD over coax or an analog, all of these settings you can only do on DVRs, right? And for IP, you can actually manually adjust bit rate and frames per second for every single camera, and they act as if their own little surveillance system.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So resolution is measured in megapixels, and in IP, meaning millions of pixels. Both image file resolution and monitor resolution are measured in pixel dimensions. So again, an example is a 2 megapixel camera. The active pixels is 1920 by 1080 pixels.
And if you guys have listened to any of our past webinars, we talked about pixel density, stuff like that. So 1080, which is, I'd say, the majority of people's TVs or monitors that they have, is a 1080p monitor. That's 2 megapixels.
Okay.
So just keep that in mind.
The higher the pixel density, the higher the megapixel.
Correct.
Okay. iframe. iframe is the frame that is used as a primary reference point that is compared to the other frames in the stream. This method allows for frames that are much smaller in size because they're only pulling the changes in reference to the original iframe. Okay. What is iframe?
So
in English.
This is pretty important. What this allows is that as the frames are going by, the NVR, the recorder, could take one frame as a large file and compare it to smaller files. This allows for faster frames per second. It allows for smaller files to be transmitted and recorded, and just use one file as a reference. So in English, it just helps you to have more drive space at a faster pace. It's just for your benefit.
Okay, and port. This is important to know this. The next two, because this relates also to DVR, remote viewing. Port is the port number is a way to identify a specific process to which an internet or other network message is to be forwarded when it arrives at the server. Ports include device port, web port, and RTSP port.
So this is pretty important, because then we're talking not physical port on the switch, but it's an identity port. So this port identifies each device. Each device on the network must have a different port in order to get out or into the internet. And we're going to go into this a little more in depth. As long as everybody knows these words as we go over the GUIs, we know what it is that we're talking about.
Okay, so is it fair to say that port is pretty much like opening up a parking spot for your device in your network?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Port forwarding. You hear this all the time. Function of network routers that allow a user to configure specific communication ports to be routed to devices on an IP network, such as a computer, DVR, or an IP camera.
So port forwarding, a lot of customers, installers are afraid of port forwarding. And today we're going to show you that it's not anything to be afraid of. It's pretty simple once you get to know how to do it. Port forwarding basically is a path that allows the device to get in and out of the internet. And we do that through ports that we just talked about. And we'll get a little more in depth in that next.
Okay, so let's move on to port forwarding. Again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to type it in the questions box and we'll answer them for you. So this is a port forwarding?
Yeah.
Okay, so go ahead, Mike.
So the first thing you're going to need is a computer. Must have a computer to do a IP system install. So inside your computer, in the start menu, there is a search bar. In that search bar, you can type in CMD, meaning command. That'll take you to the command prompt of the computer. Look very similar to the screen that you see, the picture you see on our screen. Inside there, you guys might want to write this down or take notes, ipconfig. It's a very important command in terms of having to do installs, IP installs. What ipconfig is going to show you your network's gateway and the DNS server. The gateway is what is going to allow you to get out to the internet, and the DNS server is what actually is in charge of addresses, IP addresses, name changing, stuff like that. So those are two important terms and two important commands that we're going to need to do port forwarding.
So I input IP config on the DOS, right?
Yeah, into your command prompt.
Okay, command prompt, and then I'm gonna write all these information down.
Yeah, so you can see the box that's highlighted. The two main things out of that box you want are the DNS server and the default gateway. That's going to tell you what's going to get you out to the internet.
Okay, all right.
So now that we've got that information, we're going to go to the NVR.
What are we looking at here? This is our...
So this is our NVR's GUI, and I'll go really in-depth into the GUI. But before we get into that, you need to know what the IP address is, and that's found as soon as you log into the GUI of the NVR. You're going to see a network section, and you can see that there's an IP address. You're going to need to take that down, but you also see there's a gateway and a DNS, like we just talked about. They're going to have to be input into this area. But for now, we're just grabbing the IP of the NVR so we can do some port forwarding. So take note of the actual IP address. Now that we have the IP address,
so you click on setup,
the gateway and the DNS, we can click on setup and go and actually input this information. A subnet, it's just going to tell you what the octaves of the network need to be. It's a little more advanced, but for now we just need to know, like I said, what the gateway, the DNS, and the IP addresses.
And most NVRs work the same way,
yes.
Right?
Actually, any network device, I'd say 90% of them work in this way. So it's pretty straight across the board. Once we have this information and we input it, we need to know the ports. We talked about ports earlier. As you can see on this screen, our NVRs have a control port, which is the port that's going to be used for any mobile device, for any CMS software. That's the port you're going to need to open. An HTTP port. That port is the port used when entering the NVR's GUI through a address bar, like a Internet Explorer or Firefox or Chrome. You need to know what port to use to go through that HTTP protocol.
We got a question here. Do I need to do these steps if I'm using an NVR with built-in PoE?
Yes, that's a good question. Yes, you do, because this is aside from the actual cameras. This is setting up your network to go online for remote view. So it has nothing to do with the cameras yet. This is all just to get up, see it on the phone, see it away from the actual location.
Apps.
Yeah, apps,
software.
all that good stuff. So that takes care of ports. Now that we know our ports, we know our IP, we know our DNS, and we know our gateway, now we have to go and do the port forwarding. How do we do that? Our gateway that we recorded earlier gets typed into your address bar in any
excuse me,
in Internet Explorer, in Chrome, in Firefox. We input that address into the address bar. What do we get?
Does it matter what brand switch or router you're using, or is it the same steps?
And no, it doesn't. It's going to be the same steps across the board. And once you get into, you're going to know that it's a good question because every brand can have its own terminology. It might say applications in gaming, that you guys see on the screen. It might say actual port forwarding. It might say port triggering. It might say NAT or quality of service, something like that. But they all do the same thing, but they do have different terminologies. Once you enter the IP address into the address bar, you'll get a prompt. And that's your login screen to get into the router. It might look similar to this. Like I said, every router is a little different. It might look different, but everyone will have a username and password in order to get into the GUI. So now that we have our GUI screen, go back to the ports. It's very important that you know what the ports are. These ports are, like I said, what's going to get you in and out to the internet. Control port, HTTP port, and we have a couple other ports, our RTM port, RTMP port, and a forwarding port.
Guys, to the guys that are just joining us now, we're setting up our NVR for remote viewing on your phone, and we're doing the port forwarding steps.
And these will be internal and external ports when it comes down to asking what ports, and you'll see that in a second. So, like I just said, when going to do the port forwarding, it's going to ask you for internal and external ports. Those are the same ports we just talked about. As you can see on the screen, it's the same number twice, ending and beginning. Little different terminology, like I said. And also you want to name the port. And our case, we usually have NVR1, NVR2, NVR3, one for each port. So you want to be able to know what port does what, so you give it a name that's going to help you out later on. The next part. So the IP address. We talked about IP address when we got into the NVR's setup. To record that information, this is where you're going to need it. So you enter the IP address of the device, the NVR in this case, that's going to be port forwarded. So I'm pointing these ports to the IP address that I want to be able to get in and out. And you always want to use TCP and UDP as a protocol. You want to do both. And very important to enable, once you do the port forwarding, enable the port forwarding. Sometimes people do the port forwarding, it's not working, they forgot to enable it before they closed out. So that's a very important small detail that you don't want to forget.
So is that it?
So that's it. Port forwarding is that easy.
Okay.
Like I said, a lot of people are get skeptical about doing it, kind of scared about it. It's that simple.
Okay, so one of the advantages of using IP cameras again is being able to make different configurations per camera in your network. Okay, and then we're gonna go over camera configuration. Okay.
Yeah, camera configuration. So we set up our NVR to be able to get out into the internet. So we have two types of NVRs. We have a PoE NVR, meaning power over Ethernet. You can plug the camera directly into the NVR. It grabs its own IP address, does a lot of it for you, but
Plug and play.
Plug and play. On larger scale installs, more advanced installs, camera configuration has to be done by the installer. So we're going to go over the GUI and what some of these things mean and how you do them.
So now we're actually gonna go into the camera's menu interface, right?
So first, how am I going to know the IP address of the camera? I just got it, pulled it out of the box, plugged it into my network. How do I know to access it? Each camera that we have has a search tool that's going to allow you to search the network for a camera on the network. And it's going to give you an IP address, even though it's not on your subnet or your actual network's address. It'll allow you to change it so you can do that. And this tool is where you will do it.
So this is the camera's already hardwired, right?
Camera's hardwired. You pop the CD in that comes with the camera. Okay. Run the program. As you can see, we did a search, and here we go. We found a camera. Within here, you can change the IP address of the camera to fit our network, what we need to do to get into the camera. So now we know the camera's IP is listed there. So now I can take that address and put it into my address bar and get it. Your browser.
Any browser?
Any browser. Okay. Any browser. Our new interface that will work on any browser. And get a login screen, as you can see here. By default, it's admin and admin, password and username always. So at the login screen, once I log in, I see three tabs. My live view, of course, where you're going to see what's going on live. A playback. We'll get a little bit more in depth in that a little later on, but each camera has its own playback. But our main concern right now is the configuration tab. Inside the configuration tab, you're going to find all the information of the camera that you might need to know. Software version, hardware version, manufacturer name. You can name the camera here. It's going to show you how many audio inputs it has, how many outputs it has, and any other kind of important information you might need, you'll find here. So, what settings are most important within this tab? First and foremost is the network tab. So we talked about getting the IP address. Once you're in, now we're able to, like we talked about earlier, IP address, default gateway, preferred DNS. So what does this mean? As you can see, it looks very similar to the NVR. Why? Because it being an IP camera, I can have this camera access the internet by itself, alone, aside from the NVR. That's one of the advantages of having an IP camera. But you can see the setup is pretty much the same, just like the NVR. We need to know the ports, we need to know the IP address, and we need to know the DNS and gateway. So I talked about ports. Just like the NVR, it's very similar. And you can see our 4 ports that we need to open up on our router, do port forwarding for, in order to access this on the internet. What's another important option in this tab? streams. We talked about bitrate. We talked about iframe. We talked about resolution. As you can see in this section, you can see those terms there. What we talked
So
about here.
IP cameras actually transmit multiple streams and
Correct.
at different bit rate and different resolution, right?
Correct.
And this is important because one of those streams is going to be your stream that's recording.
Correct.
Of course, you're recording, you want the best quality image that you can. At the same time, you want to remote view your cameras. So that's the second stream. That's transmitting at a lesser resolution, but only being viewed in smaller devices like a phone. So you actually see it actually still in good quality. It'll be smoother because it's less bandwidth, less bit rate, right?
Yep. That's important because a lot of times we get calls that customers are like, well, my cameras don't look as clear as they do on my monitor or on my NVR. Why? Exactly what Ken said. It's at a lesser stream so you can see all your cameras at once. It's a lot of information to transmit over a mobile network. 16 1080 channels. It's not realistic. So because of that, you're able to view them at a lower. Doesn't mean that you're recording at a lower stream. You're always recording at that best stream. So that's why that option is there.
So it shows here you can actually adjust your stream, your resolution for every stream. So you have a choice of 1, 2, and 3.
Yep. So I'll show you. Here's our stream 2. That was stream 1. Now stream 2, you can see the bit rate has changed. I can still keep my resolution the same. I don't have to, but it is. I can still have that stream 2 mobile stream come through at that same bit rate and same resolution, or I can lower it.
So would you recommend me to max out stream 1 and then stream 2 do a lesser? What type of settings should I set up for my phone?
Definitely. So you always want to do the stream 2 at a lesser stream. You got to figure the phone's a lot smaller, so less resolution is going to get you still a very clean picture because it's a smaller area. So you won't even see any loss in pixelization or anything like that. So the third important option in this configuration tab is local recording. What is that? So our cameras act as standalone servers. You can record to the camera itself. In this option, this allows you to set those settings just like an NVR or DVR of how you want to record that. Alarm recording, schedule recording. Alarm recording would be like motion, stuff like that. Do I want to record audio? And what rules do I set to that? How many days a week? How many, what stream do I want? Stuff like that. All those options you have in a recorder, you have in the camera itself. And this is where you would find that. And so where am I going to record to when I'm doing that? So you have your policy like we just talked about, but there's got to be a directory. That's where the SD card comes in. Every camera has a built-in SD card slot. How do you set that up? The same area.
Bolide IP cameras.
Bolide IP cameras, correct. And it gives you the file system. You enable it, disable it, the state that it's in, and how much space you have left on that SD card. Here's where you enable it, modify it, or do whatever settings that you need to make within the directory of the SD card.
Well, we have a question here. Can I use my SD card slot as primary recorder if I don't have an NVR in place?
Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And
what's our max capacity?
So 64 gigs, which will get you about, if you're going 1080, about 2.5 days. At a lesser stream, you can probably maybe get 6 out of it. Okay. So, yeah, a standalone recorder by itself, sure, no problem.
All right, moving on.
So we talked about the GUI for the cameras and how to set up some things in there. But what if you do have an NVR and you do want to record your NVR? We want to go through those settings. So just like the camera, we entered the address of the IP address of the camera into our address bar. Same thing with the NVR. And what do you see? You get a similar logon screen. Upon logging on, just like the camera itself, you see multiple tabs. Live view, of course, which will be your first screen. A playback, just like the camera. But since it is an MVR, we also have an alarm search. So you can search through motion detection that happen or alarm triggers that happen. A little easier to find your recordings. But we're going to focus on quick setup. Quick setup is our most important tab because it's going to allow us to do most of the configuration changes that we need in one screen. In one place, we can see everything going on all right here. For little advanced configurations, we'll go through that in a bit, but you can do here. So first thing we're going to do is add a camera to our MVR. Now this is a non-PoE MVR we're talking about. Like I said, a PoE MVR is going to add all this for you, do most of this for you, and
So this is if they have a network in place with switches in the facility and I'm adding an NVR to this network, right?
correct.
And you're hardwiring your cameras to the switches.
Correct.
Okay.
So as you can see in the picture here, we're missing number 4 and number 7. Other cameras there, maybe we swapped them out. For whatever reason, 2 of our cameras are missing. We want to add those cameras to our network now. We went through the other processes of changing the IP like we went through earlier. And now it's time to add that camera to our network. So there's a search camera button on the lower half of the quick setup. Once we hit that button and hit the search, you can see here that multiple cameras, multiple devices have come up.
Similar to the search tool.
Correct, very similar to the search tool. The only difference would be you can actually make changes here. So it is very similar. So you can see that 2 of these devices say IP camera. We can stop the search now that we know our cameras and go to the next arrow. Inside the next arrow you see our 2 cameras again. You're going to check them and slide them over to our managed camera section. Once over in the managed camera section, you see that they take place of number 4 and 7, the 2 prior cameras we were missing. So once we have that done, we can check them, hit OK, and now look, that easy. Very simple to add a camera to the MVR. As you can see now, our 4 and 7 is filled, and our cameras are on our MVR. We're ready to start viewing and recording. Very simple. So what if there's a camera that is not on our network? We search, we cannot find it. Why? Because it's in a remote place. The beauty of having an MVR is you can add cameras from other networks to your recorder.
As long as it's online, right?
As long as it's online and the port forwarding is done, you can add it. How do we do that? Inside of the MVR setup, there's a channel manager. And as you can see here, our number 4 is missing like it was earlier, but I want to add a camera to that. So the edit icon, which is a little wrench, will bring up this prompt. Channel, protocol, IP address, some of the information that we talked about earlier, port number, of course username and password, all the things that we talked about earlier that we said to write down and keep in mind, we're now using them in the MVR, not just for the port forwarding. So once this information is added, we can hit OK, and again, it's now added to our MVR. Very simple. Try to make this process as easy as you can for anybody who's using our system. And just like the other search, manually we added it. It was that easy.
Any questions? Okay. All right, let's move on.
Okay, so we've talked about the camera's GUI. We talked a little bit about the MVR GUI, but how do we make changes within the MVR for the camera? It's a little different. So let's take a look at that. So again, inside of our quick setup, we have a setup button. When that button is clicked, you have 2 options. You have the camera setup and MVR setup. So first we'll focus on the camera setup. Now we talked about doing settings inside the camera from its GUI. Now we're doing changes inside the camera inside the MVR's GUI.
We have a question here, Mike. If I set up a camera individually, will the settings reflect my NVR if I plug the camera into that NVR?
Yes, it will. Yes, it will. So a lot of times with PoE, especially PoE MVRs, certain settings have to be enabled prior to plugging into the PoE MVR because the PoE MVR takes control of that device. So you might want to make some changes prior to plugging it in certain circumstances, not all the time. Advanced configuration needs, but not too much. But for the most part, yeah, you do want to make changes prior. Once in the MVRs, you can see here, all that same information that we talked about earlier inside the camera's GUI is also here. A alarm inputs and outputs, name of the manufacturer, which is Bolide, hardware version, software version, MAC address, camera's name, all that information will be here as well. So that's configuring the camera inside the NVR SPUI. Now what about configuring the NVR inside of the NVR? We went through a couple settings earlier, but let's go a little more in depth into them. So we talked about the network config in the beginning. I didn't go too much into how to change them and what there was. We just wanted to get those numbers at first. But now let's figure out, what does all this stuff mean? And the first thing you see is LAN 1. So larger NVRs have 2 LAN ports. One would be for your local network for the cameras, and the one would be for your outside network in order to get in and out. So you can make those configuration changes right here. We talked about IP address, gateway. It's all the same information, but just in a different context. And that's all going to be found under your network option. We went over port settings. Same place, same as we talked about earlier. Same ports need to be opened. You'll find it right below the network option. So another important thing that needs to be changed, and I see this a lot, is the date. The date of the NVR. A lot of time customers call and say, I can't find no recordings. This thing's not recording. Why? Because the date's wrong. It's like in 1999 or 2000.
So before you leave the job site, make sure that your date and time is correct.
Yes, it's really, really important. I'd say 80% of the calls that come and say it's not recording, it's because the date's wrong.
It's recording, but
yeah,
it's 1999.
An important thing to tell you right now is if you go and change that date, prior to knowing what the prior date was, it's going to be impossible to find that recording.
Do you need to change the date for every camera?
So no, you don't. And I'll get to that in a second. On the quick setup, actually allows you to synchronize all the cameras across the board to the same time. They don't have to go into every single camera and change it. But for the most part, in this option here, you can change the format of the way you want it to be displayed, month, day, year, or year, month, day, and so forth. The time itself, what time zone you're in, and daylight savings if you want to enable or disable that. And if those of you aren't familiar with NTP is, Network Time Protocol, you do have to put an address in there and it will sync to that network's time. So this is pretty important because inside of our quick setup tab, there is an accounts option. That is not for the user of the NVR. That is for the users of the camera. A big question we get is, how do I add users? How do I add groups? This is where you'll do it. And you can see that there is 2 tabs there. We have a groups tab and a users tab. So let me go into the groups tab. So you can set groups, administrators, individual users, different things like that. And you can see to the right that you can actually enable and disable some of the options that you want them, allow them to have. Live video, video control, playback, alarm search. You might not want someone to be able to shut down or search for certain things or cameras on an individual account. So once we set up the groups, then we can go and do individual accounts. You can see our second tab there is users. Inside users, you can see we have an admin user, a demo user, and just a normal user. This is where you'll set your passwords to each individual user. You can see that one of the options there is groups. In this case, it's an administrator. You can lock that. Many different options you can do in this tab. This is pretty important for large businesses. A lot of people looking at a lot of cameras. This also applies to your mobile device. When someone logs in through their mobile device, it asks for a username and password. This is where you'll set it in the NVR.
How many users can log on at the same time?
So three users, yeah.
On the NVR?
On the NVR.
Okay.
Don't want to exceed that. It's a little different. It goes by channels, and it's a little more of an in-depth webinar we'll be doing in the future, but for time's sake, just say it's 3.
That's going to be part 3.
Yeah.
For we have a question here. For if I set up my cameras with different record schedules and I change my record schedule on the NVR, will that result in a conflict?
So the NVR will take over the recording. Since it's a recorder, it'll
So
take over the recording.
Okay, so it will erase
Yeah.
what you set up on the camera.
Yeah, it'll go through to the camera and change it on the camera as well.
Okay, so that pretty much wraps up our webinar today. Hopefully you guys learned how to set up your cameras, your NVR for remote viewing, how to execute port forwarding, how to make changes in the camera's configuration on the browser and on the NVR. We will send you guys a copy, a link of this webinar. We do have our past webinars available to watch on our YouTube channel. So to youtube.com, type in Bolide North America, and you should be able to see a plethora of videos from us. Again, thank you guys for joining. We do have another webinar next month, and we will send an invitation for that. But for any questions about any of our video solutions, our NVRs, IP cameras, feel free to send us an email at sales@bolidecode.com or give us a call at 909-305-8889 extension whatever. So so again, thanks for everybody for joining us. We appreciate your time and see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.